Previously on the psychology of entrepreneurship.
I've always supported the death penalty. I don't even understand people that don't. Very much in favor of the death penalty. Somebody said the other day, well, he had some psychological problems. Well, you know, in the old days, bing, bong.
It's nefarious, man. Like, the brain works in fucked up ways.
The mind is one of the most deceiving, manipulative pieces of equipment, flesh, human bodies on earth. I never have trusted my brain.
All of that weight lives in your head, and you are the decision maker.
Psychology of entrepreneurship.
Hi, it's Ronsley. If this is your first volume, welcome. This is a weekly series where I go inside the mind of an entrepreneur, artist, athlete, academic to decipher what is the psychology of our decisions. I'm Australian and I'd like to acknowledge our traditional custodians of country where I live and I work. I pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge our continuous connection and contribution to land, sea, and community. Hey, happy week 2 of 2021. How did you enjoy that last volume? I've got a few messages from you telling me how you felt when you listened to it, and it was really interesting to hear all your thoughts, or actually read all your thoughts. So I would love to hear your voice on the matter. And if you have something to say about the topic of the death penalty, please record something on your phone or on your computer and send it to Kaylee. Kaylee, what's your email address?
Well, hello. You can email me at kaylee@amplifyagency.media. That's KAILI@amplifyagency.media.
Before we get into today's volume, I want to remind you about something mentioned in volume 10, which is really relevant to the remainder of this volume. It is a very important psychological factor, if not the most important.
So one thing that's huge that I see all the time, especially when I start debating politics with my father, is something called confirmation bias. And so I think understanding something like confirmation bias can really help you if you're dealing with clients, or if you're just analyzing your own behavior, or if you're having a discussion with somebody. So confirmation bias is we humans, all of us, not the left, not the right, not the females or the male, everybody, we tend to look for information that confirms what we already believe. This is proven with science. So my father is very conservative politically. And so if we watch the exact same news conference, he will say, did you see how XYZ reinforces what I already believe? And I myself am independent. I don't like either side, but I'm very much not extreme right. So I'll say, but what about ABC? I saw those things that reinforce my belief. And so we can literally have the exact same experience and take it completely different ways. And that's because of confirmation bias. So I think knowing that can really help you understand yourself better and your tendencies. And it can also help you communicate better with people. So that's one thing that studying psychology can help you in real life or in business.
That was Laura Peterson in volume 10 for you to go back and listen to that in its entirety. But here is how important confirmation bias really is. I was introduced to my next guest and I met the man he is today, not the man he was 2.5 decades ago. And because my bias kicked in, I missed the whole reason Lyle May is in prison. My team had to come to me and ask me if I had really been unbiased in our portrayal of his story. To that, I want to say, yes, Lyle May is on death row for committing an unthinkable crime. But I'm not going to address the details of what got him into prison. You can, however, read about them in his memoir, Waiting for the Last Train. I've decided to approach this from the perspective of the man he is now, because the truth is there is no easy way to talk about this subject, but we need to talk about it. So, especially for an entrepreneur like you listening in here, knowing the bias you have is paramount. So, today we are talking with Lyle May. And I have to say that this is one of the most intellectual conversations I've had in my life. You'll know what I mean because he starts by talking about social psychology.
I think I really advanced my understanding of not just social psychology, but its relation to economics and trends when I began reading Malcolm Gladwell. I'm a big fan of his work, and when I read the book Tipping Point, it really began me to look at large-scale social psychological phenomena and how they influence our thinking through trends. Another example would be, I think, one of his books was called Blank, and it's this idea that we form our judgments about people and events and situations in a matter of seconds, and that a lot of the times that we don't stop to go back over our thoughts about those events. We just go with that first stereotyped judgment of a situation, and a lot of the faulty thinking, the fallacious thinking occurs in that period because we don't revisit it. Again, we go through this idea of confirmation bias that we don't need to seek this confirming evidence.
If you haven't pieced it all together yet, Lyle May is on death row. He has been on death row for the last 22 years. He has been published in Scallywag Magazine, J Journal, the Marshall Project, Coppernickel, and prisonwriters.com. He's also an author, the author of multiple books, and the most important book, which I have read in its entirety, is called The Crimson Letters, which you can find on Amazon. The link to that will be in the show notes, which you can find at psychologyoфentrepreneurship.com. Lyle, what can we on the outside learn from you on the inside?
The major thing that people on the outside can learn about people in prison is that we're just like you. We just didn't have the same background, or maybe we had the same background, we just didn't have the same opportunities, or maybe we had the same opportunities, but we made the wrong decisions. It's important to remember that people in prison are human beings and that they have the greatest need for understanding and the greatest need for the people on the outside to remember that prisons are public responsibility. They are not holes in the ground where you throw people and forget about them. They are a system that catches the failures of other systems. And the sooner that the public understands that, I believe the sooner that we can begin to change that.
Well, this is fascinating. What don't we know about prison, Lyle?
So I think it's important to know that even though a lot of people, or most people, believe that prisons are there to keep society safe, prisons are indicative of society's failures, not any proactive or preemptive attempt to address public safety. They're, what happens when those efforts fail. The people who are in prison are uneducated, they're mentally ill, they're poor, they're marginalized, and all the things that led to their commission of crimes, for those that did commit the crimes, are just really indicative of the failings of multiple systems in society. And that's kind of the heart of what prison abolition is about. And I have to admit, I've come late to the conversation on prison abolition, and I have my recent education to thank from the ladies at the Digital Abolitionists at Columbia University, and they've really educated me on what prison abolition means. And it's simply not that we're just doing away with prisons, it's that we're doing away with the societal ills that lead to prison. And I think that's the important distinction that people need to be aware of, that prisons are, the catch-all of society's ills, of economic disparities, of racial injustice, of police brutality, and the reaction of the marginalized to those disparities and injustices.
Prison abolition is a movement that believes that incarceration, in any form, harms society more than it helps. They are working towards a future in which vital needs like housing, education, and healthcare are met, allowing people to live safe and fulfilled lives without the need for prisons. If you would like to know more about this movement and what they're doing to achieve this, you can find a link with loads of useful information in the show notes.
So here is an interesting idea. I was told that Lyle was a master networker. He knew lots of people even before there were even phones allowed in prison. You know, all your excuses about not being able to network, well, they all kind of go out the window or the door when you listen to this.
It's important to understand that prison forces you to be social. You don't have much of a choice. Even those who would rather just withdraw into their cell and not talk with people have certainly a lot of trouble. So prison forces you to be social, and it forces you to learn about people and kind of understand your need for one another. And that is especially true as it relates to people on the outside, because on the inside you have nothing, so you're totally dependent on people on the outside. Well, the problem with that is you're automatically at a disadvantage, because if you don't already know people, it's not like you can go out and meet them on the internet, because we don't have access to a computer or the internet. So that means letter writing. I first started, letter writing in the juvenile detention center, and I understood that if I wanted to be understood, that if I wanted people to communicate with me, I had to be an effective communicator through letters. And that meant establishing pen pals and getting to know people. And it's not so much that I knew a lot of people prior to our access to the phone, it's just that I understood how important it is. And I was willing to be, you would say, more conscientious of my relationships, so that by the time we gained access to the phone, I also understood that here we had been handed this incredibly dynamic tool after not having it for so long. So I think the respect for that access only honed my interest in establishing greater connections. And as far as the people I know, it's just been really one person at a time. You meet one person and they know three more, and they connect you with one person and they know three more, and so on. And, I'll reference Malcolm Gladwell again. This is kind of his idea of the establishment of networks and trends relates to that. You talk with people, you get to know them, they also get to know you. It's certainly a two-way street, and in doing that, you develop more relationships and more and more and more until eventually you have a big network.
Before we stray too far off topic, Lyle and I were talking about the fact that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are disproportionately represented in Australian prison populations. In 2016, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people constituted just 2% of the Australian adult population, but comprised more than 27% of the national adult prison population. To which Lyle said this about his own situation.
We've been coming behind for centuries now. This is a rollover from the Civil War and the abolition of slavery and the resistance to making minorities and African American people equal to the white majority. And by establishing laws that punish a particular race, it was ultimately expanded to particular economics. And from there, it became an issue of punishing the poor and punishing minorities because, well, we didn't know how or didn't necessarily want to fix or address those inequalities. I think this is especially true as it relates to access to affordable housing, access to jobs that are competitive in wages, and it certainly goes on from there.
There are some amazing volumes we've done on this podcast in the past by Mark Yadika Paulson and Mandanara Bales. If you haven't listened to those, then I urge you next. If you'd like more context about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, go and listen to those. We now get into the precursor to the prison system. Lyle?
There is this problem in our education system that allows schools to punish students, maybe too much, to the point where these students are expelled and not allowed back into the education system. I can give you a very personal example. My first brush with the juvenile justice system in Maine ultimately led me to getting expelled from Brunswick High School up in Maine. And when my mom attempted to re-enroll me, they said point blank that because I had been convicted of a crime as a juvenile, even though they were misdemeanors and low-level breaking and enterings and vandalism crimes, that I could not be re-enrolled in the Brunswick public school system. And what that did is it meant that I wasn't going to school. It meant that I had to get a job, and it's hard to get a job as a 16-year-old in the United States. So I continued being a juvenile delinquent. I continued getting in trouble and getting locked up in the juvenile justice system and juvenile detention. And when I should have been at my high school prom, I was instead in solitary confinement as an adolescent. And that is in no way the way to help somebody grow up. And I'm not by myself in that. There are tens of, if not hundreds of thousands of other juveniles who have experienced that, and a large percentage of those who go on to be adult offenders and go to the adult system. And that is just like one small portion of the many systemic problems that lead to mass incarceration and that, are societal ills.
When we come back, how does one be so sure of their purpose, especially when they have been locked up for decades?
Our aim with this audio documentary has always been to build a strong community of entrepreneurs and creatives to provide a space where they can use their voice to share their authenticity with the world. As a valued listener, your voice matters too. We love to hear your feedback and ideas, so don't be shy to let us know how we're doing in the ratings and comments. If you have a message for our production team or know someone who would be a perfect fit as a guest, you can find out more information on how to share your input at psychologyoфentrepreneurship.com.
Welcome back. I find the level of my ignorance astounding. I couldn't have imagined a death row inmate with purpose. Well, that was all before I began to have this conversation.
First time I may have doubted my purpose, or even, it's probably prior to even really having a purpose or a sense of what that even meant on death row, beyond being here to be put to death. I was maybe 4 or 5 courses away from completing my associate's degree, and I was in a room taking an exam, and a group of prisoners were going to rec, and I had overheard one of them comment, and was like, "Man, what's he doing taking a test and going to school when they're just going to kill him? What, isn't that kind of a waste of money?" And I really kind of took that to heart, and at the same time I'm trying to focus on this test. It was hard not to think about that, and I thought about it quite a bit after that. Why am I doing this? Is it just something to do, or is there some greater end game involved? And I didn't know. I didn't have an answer to that question, and I even talked with my mom about it, and she's like, "Well, you need to do one what makes you happy, but you also need to remember that you're doing good, that the important thing is that you're learning and that you're doing this for yourself. So I guess if there was a purpose, it was that I had never tried for myself prior to coming to prison. I didn't care about myself enough to try. So that once I began educating myself and kind of got my feet underneath me, so to speak, I began to understand things about the world that I'd never understood, that had never really, been in my consciousness. So that by the time I earned my A degree, it was no longer a question of whether I had purpose. It's like, now what? Now that I have a degree, I had a responsibility, but I had to determine what that responsibility was. As I went along, I began to write. I began writing a blog, beyondstilldoors.com, as a way of just kind of discovering my writing and my purpose and what exactly that meant. And the more I read about the criminal legal system, the more I grew frustrated over my limitations in prison, the more I listened to people who had been here for decades, the more I thought about the mentors that I'd had over the years, the more I recognized that as much as I didn't want to be in prison, prison is my community. It is my environment. But that didn't just mean death row. There are millions of people in the United States prisons. There are millions more who are caught up in the criminal legal system. And there are many, many millions who over the years would have loved to have the opportunity of an education, but were never given that chance and may never get that chance. So suddenly my responsibility with having access to this education gave me that purpose, the purpose of writing about the criminal legal system, of talking about the importance of higher education, of pursuing those things for other people because they didn't necessarily know how to ask for them, or they didn't have the voice to ask for them. So I guess that's kind of how I found purpose in writing about these things and talking about these things. It's because I feel that because I have a voice and I recognize the things that other prisoners want and need and desire, that I can speak up for those things when they can't.
While we are talking about deep stuff, I want you to hear straight from the horse's mouth. I'm not calling Lyle a horse, but I want you to hear straight from the horse's mouth what it is like for a person to die in prison.
A lot of people don't seem to understand what it means to die in prison, to be sentenced to die in prison. It's not just about being executed. You can receive a life without parole sentence in the United States for just about anything, either through three-strike laws for multiple felonies, or for drug charges, or pretty much anything, including the more heinous crimes like rape and murder. I think it's important for people to understand that the life without parole means exactly that. And you're punishing the person for a crime that was committed during a certain state of mind at a certain age, and you've not given any consideration to who they might be 20, 25, or 30 years down the line. And that includes juveniles. There are a lot of juveniles in the United States who had committed crimes as 16, 14, 15, 16, 17-year-olds, and were sentenced to die in prison. It didn't matter who they would become at 40 years old or 50 years old. I was sentenced for a crime when I was 19, even though I contest my conviction and sentence, I'm not 19 anymore. I'm 42. I didn't know the same things I did as a 19-year-old. I know exponentially more, and there are plenty of people like that. And life without parole, death sentences, death by incarceration, they ignore that. They ignore that potential. And I think that's the important thing to remember. who were you at 19? Who are you at 15? Who are you at 20? Are you the same person you are today then? How much has happened in your life? Prison is no different. It might be a place where you might believe that very little goes on, but it's important to remember that our lives continue even while society forgets about that. And through the continuation of that life is the evolution of the person. We don't stop growing. We don't stop thinking. We continue that growth and continue to evolve that thinking. And that's why I will again repeat that it is so critical to have access to education to influence that growth in a positive way that is beneficial and can be harnessed as opposed to discarded. And that's what life without parole is. It's a trash can for people.
Do people deserve a second chance? We've done a whole volume on the death penalty, which is the volume before this, number 60. In that, we covered a report by Middle Ground. Here is the conversation, but for more context on the whole volume, you should listen to it at psychologyoфentrepreneurship.com.
So ending someone's life, that is the height of violence.
Pre-med, if it was calculated, I don't think you deserve a second chance. And in my opinion, for a crime like that, no, I don't care. I have no remorse. I have no mercy for anyone who kills anyone.
Okay, there was, I spoke about this the other day. There was a woman who set her husband on fire, killed him for raping her 7-year-old daughter. She found him, murdered him. That was not self-defense.
That's revenge.
It was premeditated.
That's revenge. That's
yes,
my opinion.
and yes, she deserves the death penalty. It is
What?
still she can listen. She can go through the legal. I don't care how much it hurts. I understand that. I understand it, but you still need to go through the legal process like everybody else. Mm-hmm. You don't take it into your own hands to go and
So you guys talk about the death penalty like it's global justice, like you're doing something for the world, like you're removing a threat. But that woman was doing some global justice if I ever heard it.
That was not her right to do, though. That's not how it works.
How is it that you say that a jury of your peers, that we as citizens, we as the constituency, we have that right then? What, because we have numbers, because we have some process?
A death penalty is a state-sanctioned homicide. It still is a homicide, but it is decided by multiple people.
I know.
At that point,
here's the thing. I think we need to go above the legal system in this dialogue because it was legal to have slaves.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes,
Yeah, exactly.
That
So
was
whenever we
legal
say
to
legal
unjust.
system, we have to go beyond this.
And that was also
this is where our
abolished.
ideas transcend what we're talking about.
In a report by the ACLU, they state that the United States remains the only advanced Western democracy that fails to recognize capital punishment as a profound human rights violation and as a frightening abuse of government power.
Why don't people understand the issues around the prison system? What are we getting wrong?
It's this idea that the rich believe that the poor have equal access to the same avenues that they did to get rich. A lot of the rich were born rich, and for those that made themselves rich, they had access to some of the best schools. They had none of the hurdles that a lot of minority people have to jump in order to gain access to, say, something as simple as a bank loan. But I think it's good to really talk about higher education in this because it really relates not just to people's ability to, get that come up or, raise their economic status. It's also indicative of the biggest problem with the prison system at large is the lack of access to higher education. Now, people on the outside are always and often saying, and this was kind of the argument that ended access to federal Pell Grants in 1994, which is essentially federal funds for higher education for college and prison programs. The main argument was like, well, if they wanted to go to college, they shouldn't have gone to prison. Well, a lot of people, as I said, who end up in prison didn't have access to those same average middle-class person would have. So they're already starting at a disadvantage. And then getting enrolled in a college, even just a community college, is difficult in and of itself. Because a lot of colleges, if you're convicted of a single felony, will not accept you. So there's that bar off the top. And, if you have a felony conviction, some felony convictions prevent you from access to loan programs for that higher education. So eventually the hurdles stack. And when they stack, they can look impossible, and they become a wall. And you say, well, gee, there's no way for me to get to college. And that's the important difference that people maybe are not as aware of as they should be.
Through this conversation, Lyle and I were talking about different situations not going according to plan, especially in my life, because I was thinking about them when I was interviewing Lyle. I know, for example, I got caught up in the credit system in Australia because my first business shut overnight and left me with $478,000 in debt to pay off. But while I don't have any credit cards debt, I wasn't given access to any credit for 7 years. So I can understand how getting caught in the system doesn't give you access to stuff. To which he responded like this.
That's kind of the idea of prison is once you get here, you have this felony record. For those that actually get to leave it, you go back out into society, and now you're barred from just so many different things, whether it's housing, loans, jobs, the fees that accompany with a felony record if you're on post-release supervision, parole, or probation. It makes it virtually, we won't say impossible. It makes it highly unlikely that you will in any way, shape, or form ever get ahead in life. And it's almost like once you fall off of that ladder, there's no getting back up to it. Well, I challenge the idea that there even needs to be a ladder for economic mobility. And that kind of, I guess, and this is maybe a little bit more of a dangerous topic because I'm not as versed in it, and I think that gets to the heart of the idea of capitalism, that you can create this system where, well, if you can make the money, then you can have the success. And I question if it really needs to be like that, and if in doing so we are not doing it at the expense of the people who don't have that same ability.
Before we go and wrap up this volume, here is what needs to change so we see people differently in prison.
Getting others to understand that people in prison have value, that our potential is something that can be harnessed as opposed to disposed of. And before you can do anything else, you have to get people to understand that our value to society is not something to be thrown away. And by thrown away, I mean death in prison sentences. I mean opportunities for people who have committed crimes to prove themselves worthy of second chances. I mean access to education so they can make themselves worthy of that second chance. I believe that's where everything starts. Changing our thinking about how we view people in prison and the purpose of prisons, specifically that it should be a training ground for citizens who can contribute to society, changing that from a collecting point for society's ills.
Psychology of entrepreneurship.
Coming up on the psychology of entrepreneurship.
We learn to embrace despair and fight against hope. That was a phrase that I kind of coined, from my personal experience of, being in prison, being on death row, doing numerous years in solitary confinement. One of the most defining experiences for me is my racial identity. My mother is white. My father is black. I definitely feel responsible for my actions. I don't feel like, I was just an observer as things, were occurring. You know what I'm saying? I was definitely responsible for the things that I did.
Psychology of entrepreneurship.
I interviewed Lyle May because Lyle is a prisoner on North Carolina's death row who is currently pursuing a Bachelor of Specialized Studies through Ohio University. He has been published, like I mentioned before, in Scalawag Magazine, Jade Journal, The Marshall Project, Coppernickel, and PrisonWriters.com. When he's not studying or pursuing criminal justice reform, Lyle is challenging the narrative about people on death row. To view more of his writings, go to scalawagmagazine.org and search for author Lyle May, or check out his memoir, Waiting for the Last Train, on Amazon. Lyle was imprisoned at 19 for a double homicide and has never used the internet or seen a smartphone. However, he manages to network with prestigious universities outside prison and to speak to them on his ideas for prison reform.
Psychology of entrepreneurship.
This is a Must Amplify production. Special thanks to every guest expert that has appeared on the show. Editing, voiceovers, and sound design by Kaylee Bonnyman and Tiago Vega. Guest research by Jenna Elliott. Content by Corinne Castles. Project managed by the legend that is Kaylee Bonnyman. Produced and hosted by me, Ronsley Vaz. For more episodes and way to listen, go to mustamplify.com/POE.
Love the polished audio docuseries style of this podcast, The Psychology of Entrepreneurship? At We Are Podcast, you can learn how to create a similar style for your own show. This revolutionary virtual event assembles podcasters, entrepreneurs, and marketers in one spot, so you're able to learn from the masters. Head straight to wearepodcast.com to reserve your spot at our next event.